Hello, I'm Roger Townend. I was part of the London Midland region travelling team of technicians that worked on the APT-P from the middle of 1980 to about the middle of 1983. I worked on the project off and on throughout, in some cases more off than on because the train of course kept on having problems and the fleet was first in service, then it was out of service. There were numerous difficulties because the experimental features of APT-E had not really been ironed out as part of the APT-E process. In other words, I think we went to the APT-P build possibly too soon. It might have been better having one P train and regard it as a continuing experiment rather than looking at a fleet of trains and hoping that they would be going into service to do revenue earning work. There were too many novel features introduced between APT-E and APT-P, and indeed some of the features on E-train had not been properly ironed out because it did not do enough miles in a real railway environment. It's one thing running an experiment, but it's quite another thing trying to operate a train 5, 6, 7 days a week on intensive diagrams. The train has got to go out there and it's got to run all day, every day, come whatever weather. And APT-P was simply never in a position to do that. It always needed its hand-holding one way or another. And this is where the travelling technicians came in. It had run on staff familiarisation trips in 1979 and early 1980, and this involved running on the West Coast Main Line in the Midland region. The north end of the West Coast Main Line, of course, in Scotland, there is relatively infrequent service, and to some extent you can tolerate a train that falters a bit, has to get put inside, has to get rescued. But south of Preston, things get rather more busy. Even in the 1970s and 80s it got rather more busy. And the LM region became rather concerned that it would get in the way and cause obstruction to the services. I joined in the back end of 1980, just at the time when one of the major problems reared its head, which was to do with the blending of the braking system. The hydrokinetic brake was absolutely marvellous when it worked. It was good from high speed down to about 50 miles an hour. But at slower speeds, the hydrokinetic was not effective, and it was necessary to bring in friction brake. And the blending process of bringing the friction brake in and the tendency for the friction brakes to stick on was becoming a really serious issue. So the whole fleet was grounded, more or less, at the time I became involved. So I was then hived off onto other duties, and it wasn't until the spring of the following year that things began to look as though they would run again. And I remember myself and the other members of the team were invited to Derby to the traction engineer's office for what amounted to a pep talk. So why do you think we're involved with APT then, he would ask us. And I said, to gain experience, because this should fit us to run the train successfully, and to gain experience in it so that we can perhaps become depot managers of the future. Right, so it's very interesting. What in fact you're here for is to keep the damn thing moving. It's going to get in the way. We cannot afford development engineers stopping our railway while they play with it and try and work out what went wrong. We need more practical people who will say, tie it up with string, isolate that, get it moving. And so that really was our role in life. We were based initially in London, setting up stores and a small depot base at a place called New East Sidings, Willesden, a wild and windswept location, not really suited as a maintenance facility. It was basically somewhere to take the train when it had come from Glasgow in the morning during its layover period before it picked up a return evening path back to Glasgow. So it would spend a couple of hours down at New E for cleaning, for toilet replenishment, and indeed maintenance checks, which the Island region was increasingly forced to accept were a part of life with APT. So that was the first activity, setting up London. Then when running recommenced, it was realised that the people from Glasgow would have an extremely long day if they were covering it from Glasgow all the way down to London, doing work down there with us at London, and then covering it all the way back to Glasgow, because you couldn't put your feet up. There were always checks to do, always things to monitor. So it was then decided that we, the LM region team, would locate ourselves at Preston so that we could relieve the Scots who would come down from Glasgow in the morning. They would then return home on the cushions, if all was well, and we would take the train south, deal with it at London and bring it back to Preston, where another team of Scots would have come to then take it back home. A great theory. Sometimes it worked, other times the train would terminate at Preston and go back home again, and we ended up with nothing to do. Other days it would fail somewhere south of Preston, and we would have the unenviable task of trying to move it and sort it out. This arrangement worked pretty well, including during the period of the passenger running in December 1981. This was the occasion, of course, when the train disgraced itself, but it was mainly due to the weather that caused the problems when the train froze up in the Carstairs area and was then terminated later in its journey at Crewe due to the whole railway basically being shut down. So ignominy for APT-P, but really not APT-P's fault. So the actual duties we performed on the train were to travel with it armed with tools and manuals and hopefully an ability to sort out problems. There were regular monitoring tasks to do. Typically we would sit in the van trailer vehicle. There was a monitoring panel in the van trailer which was set up to look at the position of the auxiliary friction brakes. This amounted to a small array of lights and a bleeper, so that whenever a friction brake went on or was detected to have gone on, a bleeper would sound and the light would flash. This usually required the train to stop for us to dive down and look at what was going on at track level and see if the brake really was jammed on, in which case we would try and isolate it or uncouple it. Or more often than not, it would prove to be a false alarm, because there were so many little switches involved at monitoring each and every position of the friction brake. Inevitably, in real running situations, wires break, wires chafe, wires get water in them, and there were problems everywhere. So that was a big part of it, watching this panel. Periodically we would dive into the adjacent power car and monitor the transfer gearboxes. Now of course the transfer gearbox transmits 1000 horsepower from the traction motor down to the final drive, and these gearboxes were of a unique design which I believe was designed by British Rail rather than being designed by a specialist gear manufacturer, because I believe the power transmission in the space envelope that was available was really rather marginal, and I don't think gear manufacturers were very keen to take that on as their responsibility. So it was a British Rail design gearbox which they had manufactured. In other words, the gear manufacturer would make it, but it was still British Rail's design, British Rail's problem. Lubrication of the gears was by a spray system with pumps within the gearbox. Every time the train stopped, the pumps stopped, and when the train restarted, the pumps would restart and should pump oil straight into the nip of the gear teeth. This did not always happen, So every time the train stopped and then restarted, it was necessary to go and look to see if oil was moving around within the gearbox. And often enough it did not prime due to the oil having drained out of the pumps while stationary. The fix for this was generally to top up the oil and hope that made it prime. Mostly it did. If not, it was necessary to isolate the traction motor and hope that it would cool down and allow you to get to the far end. So that was after every stop, and also every 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, it was good policy just to check that all worked well with the gearboxes. On one occasion we were heading northwards, approaching Preston, and felt a slight surge or hesitation, like sort of longitudinal shunt in the train. We were immediately behind the power car, and I had a look at the gearboxes and all looked okay. But when we had a look again in Preston station a few minutes later, it was obvious one of the gearboxes was in severe distress. It was clearly very hot, the inspection window, being perspex, was melting, and having taken the train out of service and looked at this, we found there were no teeth on the gear. It had completely chewed its teeth away, so that must have been a lubrication failure and or some obstruction in the gear teeth. This is the kind of thing it could do at any time, which is why it needed the technicians to be with it at all stages. As the train aged, I think it also began to expose some weaknesses of its production technique. Notably, I recall one incident in the April of 1983, by which time it had a considerable number of miles under its wheels. When passing through Linslate Tunnel travelling northwards, we lost a door, due, we assume, to the pressure pulse as you often experience going into a tunnel. There were seals on the doors. It was a pneumatic seal, but these were somewhat imperfect, particularly on the high mileage development train, which is the train we were on at the time. And it would appear that the sudden pressure pulse had torn the door away from its mountings. The problem was found to be the method of securing the door to its runners. There were some riv nuts within captive plates within the fiberglass door. Riv nuts are fine if they're clenched properly and make a very good lock, but unfortunately these are not being clenched correctly due to production problems, and it could literally fall off. So this is the kind of thing that would have perhaps been better ironed out with a high mileage experimental train rather than trying to deal with 3 trains and maintain a service at the same time. In other words, the optimism from APT-P was misplaced because it hadn't done enough mileage and it hadn't been in a real depot situation. Notably, again, the wheel sets were another long ongoing problem. As well as the friction brake troubles, the wheel sets, hydrokinetic brakes, had problems. Any foreign matter in the working fluid, the water glycol mix, would introduce foreign matter into the turbines of the axle, which have very close clearances. The turbines could thus break up, causing lots of aluminium powder to enter the circuit and the brake to fail, the brake to overheat. And overheating of this axle was very bad news, because the axle, of course, is bolted together. There are 2 steel conical sections bolted together over an aluminium sandwich in the middle, and the aluminium sandwich in the middle contains the turbines. Overheating results in the aluminium softening, the interference fit loosening, and then potentially you have a derailment because the axle can disintegrate. Also, heat going into the axle, which didn't have a very high thermal capacity, could result in moved wheels. So this was the reason for many of the stoppages of the fleet to try and find new ways of resolving this issue. Eventually, in early 1983, was solved using longer bolts to provide more strain energy, which retained the interference fit even when things got hot. So it didn't stop it getting hot, but it did stop it from disintegrating. So little by little the problems were ironed out, and by the latter part of 1983 we had a much better running train, and that is probably why a unit was allocated to crew for ongoing development work. It was still felt something could be learned from the project. Around this time I left the project, so I can't speak for anything that happened downstream, but it is suggested that in fact reliability improved considerably when I'd left the project. Whether this is related to my leaving I could not tell you.